Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN. We're a nonprofit that presents programming exploring human development across the lifespan. I'm honored to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Lawrence Ingrassia and Joanne Lipman. Thanks for joining us. FAN's YouTube channel has an archive of over 300 videos of past events, so be sure to subscribe to the channel to get updates when new recordings are posted. And then on behalf of FAN, I'd like to take a special note here tonight. I wish to thank the thousands of individuals from across the globe who have attended our 57 events this year. This is our last event of our season. They have attended in person and on Zoom. Your devotion to our programs and mission is inspiring to FAN staff and board members. All gratitude goes to the dozens of our sponsors and partners who collaborate with us on topics and event promotion. And thank you to all of you who generously and joyfully fund our work year after year, ensuring that our content remains free and open to all. We are very humbled by your generosity. We'll be resuming our programming in early fall. And now for some introductions. Larry Ingrassia is an author and award-winning journalist, having worked as a senior editor at the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Los Angeles Times before retiring from newspapers in 2017. In Mr. Ingrassia's decades-long newspaper career, journalists directed by him won 5 Pulitzer Prizes for national reporting, explanatory reporting, international reporting, and commentary, as well as Polk, Loeb, and other awards. In 2009, he was honored with the annual Menard Editor Award given by the Gerald Loeb Awards for overseeing coverage of causes of the financial market meltdown in the fall of 2008. In 2017, the Society of American Business Editors and Writers honored him with this Distinguished Achievement Award. Before becoming an editor, Mr. Ingrassia worked as a reporter in Chicago, Minneapolis, Boston, and London for the Wall Street Journal. Joining him is Joanne Lipman, a pioneering journalist and the best-selling author of Next, The Power of Reinvention in Life and Work, and the #1 bestseller, That's What She Said, What Men and Women Need to Know About Working Together. She has served as editor-in-chief of USA Today Network, Condé Nast Portfolio, and the Wall Street Journal's Weekend Journal, leading those organizations to 6 Pulitzer Prizes. She is also an on-air CNBC contributor and Yale University journalism lecturer. Now let's welcome Larry Ingrassia and Joanne Lipman to FAN.
Thank you so much to Louise. It is a pleasure to be here. To Lonnie. It's a privilege for me to be here with you all, and it's such a pleasure for me to be interviewing Larry Ingrassia tonight to talk about his book, A Fatal Inheritance. Larry, as you're going to find out, he's an incredible survivor. In fact, as you're going to learn, he is the sole survivor of his family, his immediate family, having lost his mother, all 3 of his siblings, and his beloved nephew, Charlie, to cancer. Now, most of us, I know I would just sort of curl up in a ball and retreat in a situation like that. But instead, Larry has gifted all of us with this remarkable book, A Fatal Inheritance. It's part family memoir, it's part medical thriller, and as you're going to see, it actually, his conclusions have repercussions for all of us. Now, before we dive in, I want to just kind of tell you a little bit about why this conversation has such deep personal relevance to me. Larry and I go back decades. We have been friends and colleagues for 30 plus years. I worked not only with Larry, but also with his late brother, Paul, who worked with us at the Wall Street Journal, who won a Pulitzer Prize for his automotive coverage. I got to know their families. I got to know their wives and Larry's late nephew, Charlie. I was really close to Paul, who actually we worked together twice when I went off to Condé Nast Portfolio magazine. He worked with me at the magazine as our automotive columnist. And I just have to tell you one quick little anecdote. One of my most vivid memories is going to the Detroit Auto Show with Paul Ingrassia, and walking with him in the auto show was sort of like being with Taylor Swift. I am not kidding. You could not go 5 feet without him being mobbed by people who wanted to talk to him, by people who wanted to shake his hand, take his picture. It was amazing because he was such a modest and brilliant guy, but I had no idea the kind of rock star he was in that community. So without further ado, this is a huge privilege and honor to be able to interview Larry. And Larry, are you with us?
I am.
All right.
Joanne, thanks so much for doing this. We go way back, and so it means a lot to me.
It means a lot to me as well. And I think that our audience is going to figure that out soon, very quickly, why. I actually want to start, Larry, just by asking, how are you doing? I mean, you have spent the past few years, like at least 3 or 4 years, reconstructing the worst moments of your life. And you've now spent these past few weeks since the book came out talking about it and answering questions that are not just about the most painful times, but in many ways, the most personal moments of your life. So how are you holding up?
Well, I actually feel at peace, and I feel good about having written this book. It was painful to write at times, but also it was very rewarding. I felt I was on this mission of discovery. First of all, it was discovery about what was this syndrome that wiped out my entire family. But this mission then became, I think, a mission of discovery about my own family. I feel closer to my sisters, especially died 4 decades ago, than I ever did. And also just kind of kind of a sense of completion. Kind of I'm in my 70s now. I can see the end. Kind of their lives were cut very short. And I wanted this to be, as I got into it, it became, as I said at the end, kind of a love letter to my family, also to all the families that have this deadly syndrome and have dealt with cancer, kind of pretty much throughout their lives, because this syndrome, kind of results in cancer starting at the earliest ages. And it's just very pernicious. So, kind of thanks. But I do feel, I tell people, I never intended to write this book, but once I started, I felt that I was always meant to write this book.
So we're going to talk about the syndrome that you're talking about, which is this inherited syndrome that a startling number of families, small but startling number of families have, that strikes family members with cancer. But before we even go there, I referenced just very briefly your family members. Tell the audience, who are the family members that you're writing about here?
So my mother died in 1968. She was 42 years old. She had breast cancer. And she had cancer off and on for about a decade. I was young then, so I don't really remember. All the records are gone. All my relatives who living with them are gone. Then my youngest sister, Angela, died at 24 in 1981. The next year, and she had an abdominal cancer, something totally different than my mom. The next year, Charlie, my brother's son, who was just 2 years old, got a soft tissue cancer in his cheek. He was given a 20% chance of survival at that time, but amazingly, he did survive. And kind of he had kind of a misshapen jaw because all the radiation killed the bone in tissue in there, but he survived and went on to have a successful legal career until he died about kind of at age 39 in 2019 of his third cancer. My sister Gina was 32 when she died in 1987. She had lung cancer. Again, kind of like Angela, died within 6 or 7 months of being diagnosed. And then Paul had cancer when he was 46. It was 1997. And lung cancer, again, giving a 40% chance of survival, had a lung removed, and yet lived 22 more years before he finally died in 2019 of pancreatic cancer. It was actually a pancreatic cancer that had metastasized to his lung. So that was it. And at that point, kind of, I didn't know much about. I knew that there was this mutation in a genetic mutation inherited in the family that had caused these. We had belatedly learned that. And I just was like, okay, what was this? What killed my family? What wiped out? I just needed to know more about it. And that was where this journey began. Again, not exactly sure whether it was going to be a book, but I just wanted to know more.
Let's go back in time for a minute, to go back to that time when first your mother died and then your sister at such a young age. These first few cancers, you thought it was a coincidence, right? No one was talking about inherited genes.
Right. If you go back into the 1960s, there was overall cancer was a bit of a black box, but especially inherited cancers were, kind of not considered as a major cause of cancer. In fact, at the time, it was believed that viruses were the main cause of cancer, and environmental secondary, but really there was a lot of focus and money going into viruses. And so, look, it was a tragic thing. I was 15 years old when my mother died. And, at that time, kind of, it was sad about, I looked up the statistics recently when I was writing the book, kind of 300,000 people died in the US of cancer that year. So tragic, yes, kind of not a huge number, but pretty sizable number. But, kind of, we didn't think anything of it. And even when my sister died, kind of my youngest sister, Angela, died in 1981, it was like, okay, well, kind of maybe, kind of this is a coincidence. It was a totally different cancer, even though research had started shifting a little bit to consider inherited factors. There was still no certainty. And then, kind of Charlie, and then my sister. And by the time my sister Gina died in 87, that's when we started thinking, hey, is something going on here? But our focus wasn't on heredity, interestingly. Our father had been a research chemist. And so we thought, well, you know what? Maybe he was bringing home chemical carcinogens on his clothes. We were ingesting them. Years later, they turned into cancer. So we really weren't focused on heredity as a cause of cancer at this point. And even then in the 80s, there was still this evolving understanding of causes of cancer and of heredity.
So at that time in the 80s, there were a couple of scientists who were starting, and this is the other element of your book, they were starting to say, wait a second, maybe it's not a virus. And it is amazing to put yourself back in time and to think about how most people figured cancer was caused by a virus. Like there was not this understanding that we have today.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think as an author
behind it.
Yeah, I think as an author, you go back in time, right? And you have to try to put yourself, not what is known now, but what was known then. And what happened, it was very interesting kind of when I started doing my research. I came across a reference to the fact that right around the time my mother died, there were two young doctors working for the National Cancer Institute. Both of them children of immigrants, Frederick Li, whose parents were from China, and Joseph Fraumeni, whose parents were from Italy. And they came across a family, not my family, but they came across a father and son. The father was 23 years old, and he had leukemia. And he had a baby son, 10-month-old, if you can imagine it. Both of them had cancer at the same time, different cancers. Again, the baby son had a soft tissue cancer in his arm. And this was so unusual that they said, kind of, is there something going on here? And they started studying that family and building a family tree. And it would take them 2 years to do that. But in doing so, they found this family was riddled with cancer for generations, not just, kind of one generation, but going back many generations, all different kind of cancers, often starting at early ages. And they published a paper and they said, we're not sure what's going on. Maybe, we can't rule out viruses because you just know it could be an unknown virus, although we don't think it is, but we don't know. We can't rule out environmental factors. And there's just the possibility of chance, there are 100 million families in the United States. So what's to say that a few families like this one, don't have a lot of cancers? That would just happen, kind of random bad luck, a little bit like we thought about our family. But they did say, is there something hereditary? Is there a hereditary factor going on? Is there a familial syndrome? But their academic paper, they ended it with a question mark. The response to that was from the cancer establishment, we don't think you're right. There was a lot of skepticism. You are young researchers, these cancers don't have anything to do with each other. They're obviously different cancers. So no. But they, weren't deterred. They decided they want to keep following this family.
By the way, what year was that? What year was that?
That was 1969. That was published. They had come across this family in 1967 and 1969. Again, it was right around the time when my mother died. And so it was interesting because there was this parallel timeline, for me to study. We were puzzling. This other family A in the paper, was puzzling. And these doctors were puzzling. And they were trying to figure out, what do we need to do? But the science was, again, put yourself back in time. The science was, the understanding of the human genome wasn't there. You couldn't look inside genes the way that you would be able to in later years. So it was this long kind of search for what's going on, tracking these families.
I find it fascinating, as you point out in the book, that their actual paper was, is this a familial syndrome? ? And resoundingly, as you point out, every other scientist said the answer is no, it's not a family syndrome. Nobody took them seriously, which is pretty remarkable. For those who are listening, I think that one of the beautiful things that you do with a fatal inheritance is how you weave your own story, your family story, together with this race among the scientists to try and figure out what was going on. They were studying other similar families. It was all happening at the same time. And so you go from chapter to chapter and you can see how, what is going on with each of these sort of races. Can you talk a little bit, I'm going to get back to Li and Fraumeni, but talk a little bit about the reporting you had to do around your own family, because at the time when you were living through it, you were not seeing it as part of a syndrome or a trend. And so also you were years apart from some of your siblings. Talk about that reporting.
Yeah, and kind of I thought that was going to be easy, and it turned out to be a little bit more challenging than I found out. Again, remember, my mother died in '68, my sister's in '81 and '87. Medical records, kind of hospitals get rid of medical records after about 15, 20 years. They just don't keep them. There's no point to keep them. So for me to reconstruct kind of what happened, with my mother, I was able to find out very little specific. I did find some old letters that she had written back and forth to her mother, my grandmother. Not in any kind of medical detail, but just kind of expressing a little bit, kind of the pain and going back to the hospital and getting hepatitis at one point. So that was interesting.
And what about, how was she talking about her 4 children? You were all at home at that point, is that right?
Yes, but not in like, oh my God, kind of what about my children? Kind of, it was more like, kind of, my mom liked to paint. And so she said, oh, I did a painting of Gina. And my neighbors thought that I did a really good job. It was, kind of, it was touching in that way, because, what it said to me that she was trying, amidst everything, she was trying to have a semblance of a normal life. And that's what people do when they're kind of going through this. You can't kind of be, kind of thinking about the pain all the time, even though it is there all the time. And then with my sister, Angela, again, she had died in '81. I didn't have any medical records. I wrote to the hospital and said, is there any chance that you did?
And how old was she and how old were you at that time?
She was 24 and I was 28. It was hard.
So,
it was hard because she died about, our father had died 4 or 5 months earlier, not of cancer. He had an heart problem. He was 59. So, kind of, there were a few months where she didn't, kind of have a parent. Both of her parents were dead. So it was Paul and me, kind of, and Gina, kind of our youngest sister, being sick. And for that, I was able to say, how am I going to find out more about that? And fortunately, my wife, who of course, kind of knew all of them. And like I said, kind of my sisters were like her sisters, kind of, I'm very blessed, my wife, Vicki, kind of, she, kind of went through this with me, supported me, but also loved them the way that I loved them. And so she remembered the first name, and I remember the first name, but she remembered the last name of our sister's best friend. And so I went onto Facebook, and I know a lot of people say, kind of, oh my God, Facebook, but there are good things about Facebook. And I was able to track down my sister's best friend. Hadn't been in contact with her for 40 years. And it was amazing. She remembered everything. She was with my sister when she got, kind of news that it was cancer. She had sat by herself. She kind of learned her hopes and fears through that whole time. And also she put me in touch with some of Angela's other friends. And so I was able to kind of build out, kind of that, kind of what was happening, what was going through my sister's mind. She shared with me a few things that Angela had written to her during that period. Again, it was a pretty short period. It was 6 or 7 months. Our sister Angela was living in Chicago. We were in Minneapolis. So we were going back and forth, but it's not like being there all the time. For my sister Gina, who died in '87, she had been married, and she kept a diary that her husband shared with me. They didn't have children, but she kept a diary from the moment she got sick until about a month before she died, when she couldn't anymore. And that was very revealing, kind of. It was painful to read as well. But, kind of, that was the process that I was going through. Kind of, how do I mean, this is about, would you think of, even whether it's the scientists or it's my family or this other family that was the focus of a lot of the research, this is about people and people's lives. And you really want to honor them by bringing that to life, to actually kind of show what they were going through, and, kind of painting that portrait of them.
In a way, you really got closer to your sisters. You learned more about them.
Yes, right. Their hopes, desires, kind of with my sister Gina and her, one of the things that was really painful, again, you have to put yourself back in a time, and I was reminded of this. Back in the '80s, I think there was this whole kind of feeling that, mind over matter. So if you got sick, and if you just, kind of had enough willpower, you could make yourself well. That might be exaggerating, but just by a little bit, kind of. And so I'm reading this, and I'm kind of in tears, because it's like, Gina, you didn't have any power over whether you were going to get better or not. You had this inherited mutation that basically doomed you. And yet throughout, kind of in entry after entry, it's like, kind of, if I just, kind of try to expel this bad stuff from my body, I'm going to get better. And, kind of what that says to me is almost like she was not exactly blaming herself, but it was partly that was her responsibility. And that was really, kind of hard to read, kind of during that period of time. So, I do feel like close to them. I feel like I know them more. I feel like, kind of, I'm happy I went through this, as hard as it was at the time.
Well, you also brought them to life for readers, for, your children and their children. I mean, it's a remarkable thing. And I noticed that you did that as well for what was called Family A. I was really touched by the fact that in all of the medical journals, they were known as Family A. But you tracked them down and you named them and you talked to them. Tell us a little bit about that.
Whenever you do a book, and I know, Joanne, you've done several books, you talk to a lot of people. Probably for this book, I've talked to 150 people. There are probably, a half dozen or a dozen people who turn out to be, kind of really especially helpful. And so, going into this book, I knew that to, kind of really bring this story to life, I needed to tell the story of Family A. So Dr. Fraumeni, who is still alive, 90 years old, Dr. Li died in 2015. He said, look, I remember the name of the family. It was Kilius, K-I-L-I-U-S, kind of, I think they were from the Midwest, but, kind of, he didn't have a lot more detail, at his fingertips. In any case, I really needed to talk to the family. So I asked the National Cancer Institute, can you put me in touch with the family? And of course, their response was, hey, kind of, we kept tracking the family, but, for confidentiality purposes, we can't, kind of share any names or contact information. I said, okay, I totally get that. If I were in that situation, I would feel the same. But how about this? If I write you a letter kind of explaining who I am, why I want to talk to you, and why I want to tell the story, I want to raise the awareness of this, kind of terrible, kind of cancer syndrome. Will you pass it on to them? And they did. And sure enough, a couple members of that family, and many of them have died, of course, because of the cancers. But a couple members of that family, kind of one, kind of a woman in her, kind of mid to late 50s, and another in her 30s, both said, yes, we'll be happy to chat with you. And that opened this whole door to me of their memories. And, kind of, although, again, one of them wasn't even born when this research started. The other was, kind of 5 years old when it started. So her memories were a little bit limited, but that opened this door for me to really learn about them. And, kind of, that was kind of, then you start building, kind of, they were nice enough to say, yes, we'll let you look at the medical records. They're at Dana-Farber. Cancer Institute in Boston because Dr. Li, while he was working for the National Cancer Institute, also was working at Dana-Farber. And so it was like one layer after the next, kind of getting to those family members, and really kind of, I felt that was so important. It was so generous of them.
So you're mentioning again Li and Fraumeni. Let's go back to them, because at the same time that your family is going through this, starting with your mom and then through the 80s with your two sisters, into the 90s with your brother and your nephew, at that same time the science is advancing, but it's a race, right? The race is on. And also they are fighting against the odds because they had been sort of written off very, very much at the beginning. Tell us a little bit about that progression and how they finally got people to pay attention.
So you know, what you find is scientific progress often comes in fits and starts. It's halting, it's not linear. And you know, if you think about cancer, and this is especially true, even in cancer-prone families, it's not like you have cancer happening every few months, so you can build this kind of very quick record. Look at my family. There was 1968, 1981, you know, kind of 82 with Charlie, 87. There's this kind of periods where nothing is happening. So one of the things they needed was a lot of patience, and you know, kind of they knew they would need that, and they would have to figure out, okay, how can we track this family, and what will we know over time as we track this family? So first of all, they did studies like every 5-7 years on this family, because do it any closer together, you wouldn't necessarily have found anything. And every time they did an additional study, and they added more families, by the way, because they didn't want to just base it on one family, because that could be chance. They added more families. Every time they did this, they found a very high rate of cancers, different kind of cancers, especially compared to the overall population. So that was significant to them. And the second thing is that in the 1970s and in the 80s, there became, you know, kind of much greater understanding. There was an explosion of knowledge about genetics and the human genome, and scientific tools to, you know, kind of study genes became much, much more sophisticated. Now, they weren't the only ones, you know, kind of, there were a handful of other scientists out there, pioneers really, who were saying, hey, we think genetics is more important in some cancers than others. And the other thing that happened is all the money that was being spent on viruses and the viral causes of cancer, they weren't finding any, you know, kind of. So in the 70s and 80s, there was a shift. There was a shift in thinking to, one, maybe environmental causes are more important. And two, maybe heredity is more of a factor because we understand genes. But again, this was a long progression over that time. And so by that time, you know, kind of in the 80s, more experts were saying, hey, you know, maybe they're on something. We still don't have proof. We're going to need proof to actually say that this is something. And that's where, you know, kind of in the late 80s, it finally, you know, kind of there becomes, as you mentioned, this race to the finish line to try to figure out what gene in particular might be at the, you know, kind of the cause, what might be the culprit. And that turned out to be challenging too, because, you know, even then with the tools, which were much more sophisticated in the 60s, were pretty basic compared to what we have now.
So it wasn't until, I believe it was 1996, or maybe it was 1990 that
1990, right.
Yes, 1990. And tell us about that. That was the first time you say that the New York Times finally actually took note of this research. And just for people listening, just to understand, as we're newspaper people, you know, you've got, particularly at a place like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, you have journalists who are scouring the medical journals, and they want to publish for a general audience, you know, the big breakthroughs. But there were paper after paper after paper by Li and Fraumeni that just nobody took any notice of.
Right. But this one, they did. And by the way, it wasn't just in the New York Times. The Wall Street Journal did a big story too. Our former colleague, late medical writer Michael Waldholz. So after doing a lot of searching and looking for the gene, they knew at some point that it probably was a genetic mutation, but they just didn't know what exactly genetic mutation it was that was at the was the culprit in this. It took, kind of a year and a half of searching throughout the genome and using some techniques that enabled you to look for fragments inside specific genes to find out what mutations. And the brilliance was they finally kind of said, there was a gene that called P53. It had been identified earlier, and the belief was that this gene maybe caused cancer, okay? But when they finally found the mutated form, what they did was they compared the tissues. Li and Fraumeni, kind of had the prescience of mind going back to the 1960s when they were studying family A and other families to collect tissues from them and blood samples, which 30 years later, or more than 20 years later, they were then able to kind of, after the scientific tools became much more sophisticated, they were able to kind of examine those tissues and look at specific genes. And in doing that, what they found was there was a mutation in a particular gene called P53 in the family members who had cancer. And family members who did not have cancer, there was no mutation in that gene. Aha, that's the answer. This gene in a mutated form, in the inherited mutated form, is the cause of it. And it turns out that it's not a gene that causes cancer, it is a cancer suppressor gene. So we all have cells that can become cancerous anytime. And because they're constantly dividing. But we also have cancer suppressor genes, the best known, by the way, of which is BRCA, which was not discovered until after this. We all have genes, we have cancer suppressor genes that stop those cancerous cells from becoming malignant. But when they're mutated like this, when it's an inherited mutation, they don't work properly. And your chances of getting cancer soar dramatically. So for example, people with this P53 mutation with Li Fraumeni syndrome, by the age of about 40 or 45, 50% will have had cancer, and that's versus 5% of the population overall. And many of those people will have multiple cancers, and starting at young ages. So this was a huge breakthrough. It was the first major genetic mutation that was identified, and it set off this race to find other mutations, including BRCA. And right now, there are more than 50 genetic mutations that are linked to a high incidence of cancer. But that was a seminal moment in the understanding of cancer and the causes of cancer and the potential ways to treat cancer, by the way.
Now, going back in time, as we're talking about, at that moment, 1990, it's in our own newspaper. Did you read it? No.
I don't remember reading it. I don't remember talking to it. Both my brother and I were editors at the journal, along with you. I don't remember reading. I don't remember talking about it. Again, I think that we were so focused on, we knew the answer. Our father was bringing home these chemicals on his clothes. That must have been it. The other thing is, again, even though this got, it was big news at the time in the medical world, certainly, and somewhat in the world beyond, it was considered very, very rare at the time. If you look at the stories that were written in November 1990 about the kind of breakthrough, huge discovery of this genetic mutation, it mentioned Li Fraumeni syndrome. It said, it believed that there are fewer than 100 families in the US that have this. So not only did we not suspect it, and I wish we had asked questions, but no doctors that he had said, oh, by the way, you may have this inherited syndrome. I think a lot of doctors were not aware of it, kind of until the 2000s, 2010. It was considered that rare. And it wouldn't necessarily put a lot of pieces together. You wouldn't say, oh, by the way, you have all these different cancers, kind of, maybe they should have. And the final thing, which I forgot to mention, Joanne, about why we didn't suspect heredity, and we were focused on our father and maybe bringing home in chemicals. Before our mother, there was not a history of cancers in our family. Okay, yeah. Her two parents, no cancers, both lived into their 80s, and were, kind of relatively healthy their entire lives. Her only sister, no cancers, lived into her 80s. Her sister's two children, no cancers. So how is it that we had this hereditary gene in the family, and there were no cancers before that. And so I asked that to the doctors. Again, I think that threw us off track. And I asked Dr. Fraumeni about that. And he said, well, he said, in about 5 to 10% of cases of people with this syndrome, it is what is called a de novo mutation, D-E-N-O-V-O. It means new. And so it means that your mother, when she was at the point of conception, when she was conceived, had a mutation that did not exist in either of her parents. But because she had that mutation, she could, as an inherited, kind of mutation in her genes, she could pass it on. And she did. But again, that was another reason why, I think Paul and I didn't pay a lot of attention to it. I kick myself now, and why didn't we at some point, kind of after he had his second, third cancers, after his son Charlie had more cancers, ask? I wish I could turn back the clock in time, but we didn't.
When did you find out that there was this genetic predisposition and that your family had it?
I remember very distinctly, and it was December of 2014. And the reason I remember is that my brother who he survived lung cancer, he had prostate cancer, and he had his prostate removed. So, he had a PSA test in December of 2014. He's not supposed to have any reading. Kind of prostate PSA is a marker for, kind of prostate cancer. And his PSA level was increasing. And he called me up to, I think maybe even sent me an email and said, hey, kind of it's going up. I'm a little bit concerned about that. Kind of my doctors are concerned. He says it's a bummer, kind of, but I think, kind of I'll deal with it like I've dealt with everything before. The next day, he actually called me up and he said, my doctor has recommended that I get a genetics test. And I said, oh, really? What's that about? He says, well, there's this thing called Li Fraumeni syndrome, and there's this, gene called P53. And he thinks that given all the different cancers in our family, different ages, different types of cancers, that we may have that in our family. And the reason I remember this so distinctly is because I said, how do you spell that? Again, I was sitting at my desk at work, and I jotted an email to myself. Often do that to try to remind myself when I'm busy with something, so I come back to it later. Jotted an email to myself, sent it to myself. It was like, kind of a 2-line email saying that he's going to get a genetics test. It's for this thing called Li Fraumeni syndrome. It's P53. It's a cancer suppressor gene. It's supposed to stop cancers, and it does it when it's not working. That was like that was my first introduction to it. A month later, he sent me a note saying, I've tested positive for it. And he said, and you might want to get tested at some point too.
And did you?
I didn't right away. I don't know
why. Why not?
I probably, so first of all, given look, I knew not much about this, but kind of, if you have this mutation, given what the likelihood that you are going to get cancer is very high, especially by the age of 60. So here I was like 62 or so when I got this news from my brother. I put it off for about a year, and my daughter kind of said, Dad, I want you to get tested. So it turns out there is like a 5% chance that if you have this mutation that you will not get cancer in your lifetime. Okay, it's a very low chance. But I think for peace of mind and for my daughter, just to make sure that I didn't have it and thus couldn't pass it on, I finally went and got tested. And sure enough, I tested negative. I did not care. So obviously the only member of the family, there's a 50-50 chance that you will inherit this mutation. That's the way it works. And, I didn't. It was, kind of quirk of fate, kind of luck of the genetic draw. And
how did you feel when you got that test back? What was that like?
I felt, kind of maybe a little bit of relief. I didn't think I had it. And what helped a lot, I sent the, people have asked me, do you have survivor's guilt? I sent the result off to my brother, kind of, and said, hey, I've tested negative. And literally within a minute or two, by email, I got, kind of a 2-word response. Great news. And, how easy would it have been for him to say, why me? Why not you? And I've unfortunately, kind of in doing some of my reporting, I came across families where some family members really felt, kind of angry, kind of, and felt the why me. It's an irrational response because the why not you, they don't have a choice, kind of whether they got it or not. but, kind of to Paul, and I think, Paul and I were very close by this time, kind of we're the only surviving siblings. We worked in the same business. We had a lot of the same friends like you, but still it would have been easy for him to, kind of maybe, say that. Not even a hit, not a whisper of it. It was like he felt happy for me. I think for my brother, when he learned he had it, it was a sense of a little bit relief. Now we know, but also I think that he felt bad because, kind of he knew that he had passed it on to his son, Charlie. And that was a very hard thing.
Speaking of that feeling of that, why me? I mean, you would have every reason to have that feeling yourself. Like, why me? I am the sole sibling, and all of my siblings have died. And I look on Facebook, and everybody has out there with their families. Think about that.
It is a strange feeling. One of the things I talk about in the book a little bit, a lot of the people I know, even my age, kind of in the 70s, kind of, they have all their siblings alive. They get together, they get on the phone, they talk to them. It's stuff that I did with my brother all the time. And, kind of have none of your siblings, there's this whole, there's this whole shared memories you have with your siblings that you don't have with anybody else.
Right.
You don't have with your spouse, as close as you are with your spouse. They didn't know you when you were probably, kind of for most people, kind of when you were 5 years old or 8 years old or 15 years old. So, kind of, I think, in thinking about that, I mean, that's something in writing the book that I think I felt strongly, kind of this thing that I had missed out on was kind of growing old with my siblings, something that, kind of a lot of people I know kind of have that. And I tell you, it's something that really pains me. And for anybody who's kind of here with us today, if you're estranged from your siblings, kind of, I would just urge you at some point to figure out how to undo that. You're lucky to have your siblings alive, and kind of try to treasure that, try to overcome whatever differences that you might have, because kind of that's a connection that kind of I don't have, and I wish I had.
In the book, one of the and I remember this from life. I remember Paul telling me all the time. I heard that phrase, "Fight like Charlie." Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, Charlie was a really special kid. Again,
that was Paul's son.
Yeah, it was Paul's son. He had his first cancer when he was 2 years old. Kind of he had kind of a lot of radiation, which was needed to basically save him. But the radiation also kind of killed a lot of his bone and muscle tissue in his jaw. So as kind of after he got to a certain age, kind of he had numerous reconstructive surgeries, kind of very painful. But he was, one of the things I always admired about Charlie is that, kind of, even though cancer was this ever present thing in his life, he didn't let it define his life. Kind of played football, kind of was active in everything the way, kind of most kids are. Went to college, went to law school, had to take a year off between, college and law school because he was getting more reconstructive surgeries. Kind of did very well in law school. And then, kind of kind of after a long period, and this is actually not uncommon with Li Fraumeni patients. After a long period, when he was 30 years old, 28 years after his first cancer, it comes back. And it came back as a colorectal cancer. And this is the one thing where I wish we had known earlier. And, kind of I urge everybody to try to, if you have a number of cancers in your family, kind of consult a genetics counselor, consult your doctor, kind of get tested. So Charlie started having some, kind of problems. He had gone on a trip to Turkey. He came back and, had upset stomach, kind of bowel problems. And his doctor kept thinking it's got to be something else. It had to do with the trip. Maybe it's Crohn's, maybe it's this, maybe it's that. When it finally didn't go away, 7 or 8 months later, he finally kind of said, well, maybe we ought to get, a colonoscopy. And it was at that point that he discovered that it was a later stage colorectal cancer. As a result of that being later stage, he had to get a lot of radiation. Again, fight like Charlie. He beat the cancer a second time even though it was a late stage, it was really tough. It was really tough. But he beat the cancer. And then, kind of 8 or 9 years after that, he, kind of got his final cancer. And it was only kind of a month after Paul got pancreatic cancer in 2017. And it was hard because of all the radiation that he had gotten. It came back in, Charlie got a bone cancer in his hip right when he was getting the radiation for all the colorectal cancer. And I wonder if that had been diagnosed earlier, would he have had so much radiation? Would that cancer have come back? And again, fight like Charlie, he kind of said he was determined to beat this cancer. And one of those just heartbreaking things, kind of in all this saga is that in an effort to save Charlie's life, they had to amputate his leg up to and including his hip in order to just kind of rid him of the cancer. And for, kind of a few months, again, not defeated. He said, I'm going to get a bicycle where I can, kind of just with one pedal, but I can do this because he likes cycling. I'm going to, kind of come back from this. But it started metastasizing. And, kind of 6 months or 8 months later, kind of he would die. And, kind of that was, I think for my brother, I never talked to my brother after that. That was in February 2019. Paul would die in September. I never talked to my brother after that he didn't cry. Kind of, he just was in such pain for his son. I mean, everybody knows losing a child is really hard, but kind of after all that Charlie had gone through, for that to happen, I think was the most, kind of heartbreaking thing, certainly for my brother.
You learned so much about your family. I know we're running short on time. Maybe just we could end with, tell us a little bit about what you learned about Angela and her doctor, and maybe just spend a minute or so reading from the book on that topic.
So again, as we were, kind of, we talked about, kind of when you're reporting, you're trying to find out all the different people who can tell you something about, kind of the people. And I thought, I really like to talk to the oncologist for my sister, Angela, just to find out what he might be able to tell me about her treatment and what her chances of survival were. Kind of course, very rudimentary. He didn't have there's been so much progress. And so, kind of after searching online and kind of with a little bit of help from my sister-in-law, Sue, kind of, I found somebody who I thought might be, we weren't sure, found somebody who might be her doctor. His name there was a retired oncologist, Gershon Locker in Chicago, who had practiced medicine at the hospital where my sister was treated. And we had remembered that the last name of her doctor was Locker. So I thought maybe this was him. And so I sent a LinkedIn message to him, basically saying, hey, I'm trying to find the doctor of my sister. I don't know if it's going to be you, kind of can, and I'd like to talk to you if that is. And then this happened. My eyes welled up the instant I saw the subject line on the email that had just appeared in my inbox. I have never forgotten your sister. Only a few hours earlier, I had sent a LinkedIn message to a retired doctor, wondering if by chance he happened to have treated my sister Angela 40 years earlier. Was he Angela's doctor? And even if he was, what were the chances he might recall one patient he treated many years earlier out of the thousands he had cared for? I wrote, I realize you may not remember my sister Angela's case, as this was decades ago, but if you do, I'm hoping to speak with you. I wasn't sure if I would hear back, so his quick response floored me. The day after your sister died, I received a beautiful flowering plant at home. Not only do I remember her, so does my wife. I was in tears then, and I am now, he responded. I sat silently for a few minutes to gather myself. Then I sent Locker a note, and we set a time to chat on the phone a couple of days later. I was a basket case when I got that flower, he told me. That's not something you ever forget. How Angela had gotten his home address, he didn't know. Locker was just 33 years old at the time, but even after all the years, he said, I can almost see her. I can remember her room on the 9th floor. She never complained, ever. When we're gone, we live on in memories. Those memories can remain surprisingly vivid for a long time to the people whose lives we have touched, however briefly. This is me writing. I was moved that Locker still treasured memories of Angela, but I know memories invariably can fade and even be lost when the people whose lives we touched are themselves gone. So while this is a book about scientific discovery begun by two tireless doctors, it is even more a love letter to my family, written to preserve memories for my children and their children and the children after them. Because I will be gone someday as well, and I don't want these memories to be gone with me.
And Larry, you so beautifully told that story, and it is a letter to your family. And I cannot thank you. In the process, also really illuminating the science around it, which has so many implications for the rest of us. If you have cancer in your family, if you want to get that kind of genetic testing, if you understand that, and you know, as you said with Charlie, if you knew that it was that you had that predisposition, maybe you get more screening earlier. So you have done such a service, but above all, it really is a love letter, and I cannot thank you enough for writing it.
Thanks, Joanne. I'm hoping that this does raise awareness. I've received a lot of wonderful emails from people, and some of them saying, you know what, we've got a lot of cancers in our family. We don't know if it's genetic, but we're going to get tested. And I think that that's great, because catching cancers early, getting tested, you can get screened, and then catching cancers early is the best way to survive cancer. And I can only hope that, you know, kind of fewer families go through the pain that Li Fraumeni families go if they've read this book and kind of have something done about it.
Do you know, by the way, if the genetic testing that is routinely done, let's say when someone's pregnant or they're getting married, or, you know, does that include testing for this, or is this a special test?
I don't know. That's a good question, and I will check that out. But, you know, kind of usually if there's a special genetic test for cancer-related mutations, like 20, the most common 2 or 3 dozen. And they'll kind of, so it's not just for one, that's the great thing. It's for a lot of mutations. And often you can get
that 23andMe.
Insurance often will cover it. It only costs $250. I know for some families that might be a lot, but insurance often will cover it if there are a lot of cancers in your family.
Tell us if we're allowed to have another minute. I know we're running short. Tell us a little bit about what you have heard, about the response that you've heard from readers.
You know, it's been really heartening. You know, kind of, there's been a lot of thank you. There's so little understanding. If you have this Li Fraumeni system, you know, kind of right now, it's believed maybe 5,000 or 10,000 families in the U.S. have it, but that's out of more than, you know, kind of 125 million families. So people are constantly having to explain it. They're actually kind of, occasionally they're going to their physician, usually not an oncologist, but they're going to their physician and saying, I've got this thing called Li Fraumeni syndrome. And they're like, what? How do you spell that? And so, you know, a lot of it is saying, hey, finally somebody kind of has recognized this, has written about this, and has educated, you know, now I can say to my friends and to, you know, distant relatives and doctors, if you don't know, kind of read this book, you will understand, you know, kind of what this is, and what, you know, kind of my family has been going through, and why, you know, kind of I'm fearful all the time, you know, because you can get any, you know, kind of at any age, any type of cancer anywhere in the body, which is unusual, especially, you know, kind of most of the cancer genes are site specific, like, you know, Lynch syndrome, named after Henry Lynch, another pioneer, is mostly colon cancer, or BRCA is mostly breast and ovarian cancer. This is anywhere. So I think a lot of families feel, thank you for writing this. So this is for my family, but it's for all those families.
And it's also for the families of, you know, the Kilias family, the other families that I thought that was so poignant, that you really took the effort to it's a love letter to your family, but it's also making sure people remember the names of those who passed away even years and decades ago.
And you know, kind of one of the people who really helped me was which it took a while to track her down, but the wife of the young man and the mother of the baby who had cancer in 1967. And Nancy Kilias Gould. And after I wrote the book, she sent me a note. Of course, I had interviewed her and she was very helpful. She said, you know what, it was painful for me to read, but you brought my, kind of husband and son back to life in a way, I recognize them, and I just, kind of want to thank you for doing that. And that touched my heart, yes, this was part of the reason, so that, they're not forgotten. Their contribution to science, but also who they were as people, is not forgotten.
That was, I choked up every time that you wrote about Paul, who, as I mentioned earlier, I was very tight, very close with your brother, Paul, worked with him, adored him, heard all through the years about Charlie and Charlie's many challenges. And what you didn't mention, when Paul had that first cancer, the lung cancer, we were like, who gets struck by light. That was everybody. I so vividly recall how ill he was, and everyone saying, well, this is just, this is such an outlier, right? Nobody was sort of putting those pieces together at that point,
including us. Alas.
Joanne, I want to thank you, Joanne, for a really great conversation with Lawrence. I mean, obviously it helps that you are longtime colleagues and friends, but you just really, it seems like you've hit some of the really beautiful parts of the book and have brought it forward for everybody watching. So I want to thank you so much for that. I want to remind people that Larry will be at After Hours together. You see Joanne looks like she was frozen there for a minute. Larry will be at After Hours. After Hours is going to start at 8:05 Central, which is in about 7 minutes from now. The way that you get to After Hours, buy a copy of A Fatal Inheritance. Fan is going to gift a second copy to everyone in After Hours. So get a copy in the receipt from our bookseller. We've been putting that link in chat the whole time. And the receipt from the bookseller will be the link to register for After Hours. Come join us. Talk to Larry a little bit more about more specific questions that you might have about both his story or just the story more generally. There's so many different angles that could be pursued here. And come join us. We'd love to have you there. So Joanne, thank you so much for that. We're at 7:58. So Larry, there is 2 points were made. One person about the screening for preborn screening. Someone had posted in no preborn screening yet, and not with blood tests for marriages. And then they gave us a lfsassociation.org has excellent information support. So thank you to that person who put that in. We do appreciate.
And they were very helpful. The Li Fraumeni Syndrome Association, very helpful and kind of great resource for people who, have it or suspect they might have it.
And then there was one other post from someone who does have her in-laws have Li Fraumeni in their family. It's a longer question and post, but I'm going to get to the piece that I think perhaps maybe if you want to address. Okay. Her mother-in-law tested positive and has passed away. Cousins and siblings were tested, except for her husband. 3 of the cousins have tested positive. She says her husband does not want to get tested. She would like to know for their children's sake. I was wondering if you had a thought on that. I'm sure you can appreciate that, I would imagine. And we have about 1 minute.
It's a personal decision, obviously. Yeah. Okay. But there's a strong reason to get tested. Okay. If you are a carrier, if you have the mutation that might pass it on to your children, think about your children. Maybe, yes, it is worrisome to know, but it's more worrisome not to know, because every study that has been done about people who have the mutation and get regular screening is that they will live longer. And they'll live longer, because the cancer will be caught in the earliest stages. And, again, this can strike anywhere in the body. If you don't know and you're not getting tested and you're not getting screened, often those cancers are going to not be found until a later stage. So I just would urge people, it's a personal decision. Talk to your physician, talk to a genetics counselor. It is for your children that you really want to know as much for yourself.
Yeah,
okay.
I appreciate that.
And you know what? You might be negative like me and not have to worry about anything. And then you kind of don't have to worry. But if you are positive, then you can do something about it.
That's right. That's right. Okay, 8 o'clock. Thank you again, Joanne. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure getting to know you. We appreciate at our very last event of a long season. Thank you so much for a great way to wrap up. Larry, you have a 5-minute break before we open up the after hours room. So we will see everyone in just a few minutes. And for those of you joining us, we'll be seeing you, as I mentioned, in about 5 minutes. And for those of you who can't join, thanks for a great fan season. And we will resume our programming in early September. So thank you so much. And good night, everyone.